Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everybody to Eurodad's Debt Wednesdays. My name is Emma Bürgisser. I'm with the Bretton Project, and the focus of today's webinar is about taking a broad perspective to debt justice and understanding the relationship between debt and some of the other central challenges of our time, namely the climate crisis and the existential threat to the fulfillment of human rights and gender equality, which are all exacerbated by the context we currently find ourselves in of the COVID pandemic. So welcome all again to this very important discussion that I'm really happy that we're having here together with all of you. So I will start out with a few housekeeping remarks. This webinar is being recorded and interpretation is available in English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. So you can find your interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. And if you're hearing a buzzing sound and wondering what that is, I apologize. That's my very tired laptop. So I'll make sure to keep my comments very short today and mute myself so you won't be hearing that throughout the webinar. If you have any technical questions or issues, please use the chat function. And Ilaria with Eurodad is on standby to help out with any of those issues. And so this webinar is part of a joint project by the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, or APMDD, the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, or Eurodad, the European Network on Debt and Development, Eurodad, and the Latin American Network for Economic and Social Justice, or LatinDad. So that's all the dads, as well as Jubilee USA. And I'd also like to express our gratitude for the financial support provided to help make this series happen, which includes the European Union, Bread for the World, Open Society Foundations, and Avena Americas. And thanks also to OCISA for providing Portuguese interpretation today. So we have 2 hours for today's discussion. So we're going to start off on 2 presentations relating to climate justice first, after which there will be time for a Q&A. So to ask your questions, please type them in using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So I can try to get everyone's questions in order, hopefully. And on asking questions, so there's a lot of different people on the call today with a lot of different experiences and levels of knowledge on the issues we'll be discussing. So I want to make clear that this is a safe space for anybody to learn. Please don't be afraid to ask any question at all. We're all here to support and learn from each other. So please don't be shy. Then we'll make time for a short break around 4 p.m. hopefully, and then we'll move on to our second pair of speakers that will focus more on human rights and gender justice, followed again by another discussion with all of you. So without further ado, I will now present our first 2 speakers, which we're really lucky to have, who'll be speaking on debt and climate justice. So first we have Lidy Nacpil, who is the amazing coordinator at the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. And after Lidy, we are going to go to Iolanda Fresnillo, who is the Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer at Eurodad. And I'm just checking whether, yes, Lidy's there. Great. So Lidy, I will hand over the floor to you. Welcome.
Yeah. Yeah. So sorry. Can you see my screen though?
We can see your screen and we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. So just a apology. I didn't have time to do really colorful and interesting slides. Like this first slide is by Eurodad. Very nice cover page. So I'd like to just help begin the whole discussion with a framing of the issues and some major points about how we see solutions, just solutions to the debt and climate crisis and what we see as the false solutions being offered for so many years now. And yeah. Next. There. I think we are missing the first. Okay. So one of the greatest injustice in the climate crisis is that people of the South who contributed to the least to the problem bear its greatest impact. And we can say the same thing about the debt crisis. Those who have the biggest share of responsibility for these problems, who generated and accumulated wealth in the process, have the obligation to address these problems. And yet what we see are inadequate actions and false solutions. The debt and climate crisis share roots in the same global economic and financial system. It is a system which breeds and exacerbates injustice and inequality across and within countries, generates a net outflow of resources from the South to the North, concentrates wealth on elites and big corporations, created a financial system at the service of profit accumulation, and subordinates Southern economies to the global market, and impoverishes Southern countries and billions of people globally. It is also a system that involves wanton natural resource extraction and plunder and overproduction for the relentless pursuit of profit, with excessive and ever-increasing use of fossil fuel energy. Debt cancellation is urgently needed to free up public resources for urgently needed public goods and services, especially in the face of health pandemic, the economic fallout, which made life much worse for the billions already living in poverty, and the worsening climate crisis. And of course, to address the injustice of illegitimate debt. But it is also urgently needed to provide space to help pave the way for more strategic and structural reforms in the economies of Southern countries to stop the constant bleeding and borrowing and build strong, equitable, gender-just, and sustainable economies. And global systemic changes must also take place, especially in the policies and practices of international lending and borrowing, and more broadly in the larger inequitable and exploitative economic and financial relations across countries. But we only see inadequate and false solutions. Debt relief measures have historically and to the present day remained inadequate and have been mainly motivated to stabilize Southern economies so that they may continue to repay debts and conduct business as usual and clean the books to be able to continue borrowing. These debt relief measures, which I think the other speakers will speak more about, are carefully crafted so that the logic of the system and markets are not subverted and the interests of creditors are not compromised. Justice and real systemic solutions are not part of the equation. On the other hand, and so we're not absolving our own governments in the South, most Southern governments are more concerned about protecting foreign investors and domestic elites, maintaining credit worthiness and continuing to pursue loans and leaving their economies in business as usual mode. Sorry, I'm having problems with slides. The destruction of natural carbon sinks and the excessive and ever-increasing emissions of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel use and carbon-intensive, highly profitable industries, on the other hand, had led to the climate crisis. Peoples and communities of the South, farmers, workers, indigenous peoples, people of color, and especially women and children among them, have been rendered most vulnerable to climate change impacts because of poverty, discrimination, and the precariousness of their living conditions, greatly intensified by the debt problem. Climate solutions based on science, fair shares, and justice are clear. Mitigation actions based on historical and continuing share of responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. For the richest industrialized countries, this means reaching real zero emissions domestically by 2030 and meeting the balance of their fair shares of emissions reduction through climate finance for mitigation. For the rest of the world, this means reaching real zero before or by 2050. This is the timeline for ending fossil fuels, transforming highly extractive and high carbon emitting industries, and massive ecological restoration. Yet again, we only see inadequate and false solutions. Many countries of the global north have made recent pronouncements of so-called greater ambition in climate action, but they speak of net zero, a deceptive and dangerous concept which includes the use of unreliable and potentially harmful technologies such as carbon capture and storage, or CCS, or an innovation which is called BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, and market mechanisms, measures that will allow them to still continue emitting greenhouse gases, although reduced, and not have to reach actual real zero. Their targets for net zero is way beyond the timeline needed to keep global temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees. And despite the promise of climate finance to reach a minimum of $100 billion per year by 2025, an amount already very inadequate, the pledges in the last 6 years have barely reached $4 billion a year. The actual delivery is even lower. New pledges recently announced will not even take us significantly closer to the $100 billion per year. Added to that, a big proportion of climate finance pledges are also in the form of loans, which betray the principle and intent of climate finance. So one of the latest study is for the year 2018, where it was found that 75% of climate finance was actually in the form of loans. Global North countries' public subsidies for fossil fuels, on the other hand, are 5 times bigger than their climate finance pledges. The debt crisis has rendered peoples of the South much more vulnerable to the climate crisis. The climate crisis is being used as justification to peddle more loans to the South, further exacerbating the debt crisis. The climate debt owed to the South is huge, but it is just a part of a much larger historical, social, ecological debt owed to the South. And financial debt payments being collected from us are minuscule amounts compared to what is owed us. There must be restitution and reparations and a profound transformation of the global system and national economies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lidy. That was a really clear introduction to some key concepts and really the bigger picture of how debt and climate crises are intertwined. So thank you so much for that. And then I think we're gonna delve into a bit more detail now with Iolanda. So Iolanda, please, you have the floor.
Here. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Emma. Thanks a lot, Lidy, for the introduction. And I really appreciate you both being here, and also Emilia and Juana afterwards. It's we were saying before starting, this is a great panel, and how great would it be if we could meet in person to discuss these issues. I hope the participants are not tired of seeing my face, because it's my third intervention in this series. But I really wanted to participate in this one on climate issues. Let me just 1 second, because I have problems seeing my own screen. Here, okay, great. So what I wanted to introduce today is what we've been calling, and this is not our idea, it's Heron's Belfon idea. She's from Jubilee Caribbean, and in a paper she was saying that the interlinkages between debt and climate create a vicious circle. So I'm going to try to explain this vicious circle and on how these two crises that Lidy explained how are faced with false solutions up to now actually feed each other and make the problem even bigger. I'm going to start with climate. If you see the shim in the screen, Lidy was saying about this differentiated responsibilities and the responsibility of the global north and the climate debt owed by the global north to the global south, which is actually not only a debt, but also creates increasing impacts in the global south. So the global south are every year suffering from the impacts of huge hurricanes, droughts, and other climate extreme events, and have to face this climate crisis without the support or without the sufficient or adequate support of the polluters through this climate finance. Since there is no sufficient nor adequate climate finance and not finance for what it's called loss and damage, this is finance for recovery and reconstruction after a climate extreme event, countries in the global south find themselves in a situation that they need to borrow because there's no grants available to invest in climate mitigation, but especially to invest in climate adaptation, but also to borrow for reconstruction and recovery after a climate extreme event. This is what happened in Mozambique after the Hurricane Matthew. This is what happened in Barbuda in the Caribbean, in many countries after a climate extreme event, when there are no enough resources from the international community to face the reconstruction and to face the emergency, and the countries are left with little option but to borrow and increase their debts to face the impacts of these events. The third element is what Lidy already mentioned, which is that the climate finance that is being, the little climate finance that is being delivered is actually mostly in the form of loans, which also increases the amount of debt of these countries, of the countries in the global south. The fourth element of the vicious circle is that when countries in the global south need to borrow, they are offered loans from financial markets at a higher interest rates than the countries in the global north. But particularly if you are a vulnerable, climate vulnerable country, these costs are even higher. So climate vulnerable countries are paying more for these borrowings than other countries. There's a study made a couple of years ago around the V20, which is a group of 48 climate vulnerable countries, and the study concluded that in the last 10 years, these countries have been paying more than $40 billion extra in these additional interest rates because of being vulnerable to climate and because of the perception of higher risk from the financial markets. So all these trends and all these lines create an increasing public debt. The inexistence of a multilateral, fair, and transparent debt workout mechanism, we spoke about this a couple of sessions ago, the insufficient or adequate finance for development, the tax dodging, and the issue of not having enough domestic resource mobilization also influences in this increasing public debt, together with what Lidy was mentioning, the existing historic social, economic, and environmental debt because of the colonial heritage, because of the neo-colonial North-South relations, but also because of the capitalist financiarization system. Sorry. This brings countries into situation of debt distress, so having difficulties to repay their debts. This is seen as yet another risk by the financial markets, and these countries have to pay even higher borrowing costs when they are in debt distress. This brings the countries to a situation where they need to find resources to repay their debts because there are no solutions put in place to face this problem. And they rely more and more on fossil fuels and natural resources exploitation to repay the debts. So they're going actually in the contrary direction that we should go in terms of achieving net zero emissions. This has an impact on the climate emergency. The increase in public debt also reduces the fiscal space for social investments and for climate investments. So the higher the debt, the less possibilities the country has to invest in mitigation, so to tackle the climate crisis, the climate change, and in adaptation to actually be able to confront the impacts of the climate crisis. And finally, when these countries suffer a climate extreme event, a hurricane, a drought, their payments continue. So there is not a single element to stop the payments even after a disaster. I wanted to talk a little bit more about these false solutions. Within climate finance, multilateral development banks, international financial institutions, and donors in the global north have been proposing several innovative instruments, saying this could be helpful to tackle the climate crisis. And there's someone with open microphone, maybe. I think it's Mike. Can you close the microphone, please? To continue. This market-based approach to climate finance are also some of these false solutions that Lidy was talking about. One of them, for instance, is risk insurance. So, global institutions like the World Bank is telling countries in the global south, let's contract an insurance. And if there is a climate extreme event, then the insurance company will pay for it. Well, the reality is that payouts really cover the losses and damages after a climate extreme event. And the cost of this risk insurance is actually put on those who suffer the damage, but not those who cause the climate emergency. So it's actually not really climate finance. It's not delivering the differentiated responsibilities. A similar situation can happen with the hurricane clauses. Hurricane clauses can be an interesting element. These clauses are attached to loans. So if a hurricane or another extreme event happens, the clause is triggered and part of the debt can be canceled, or there can be an extension of the period within you can repay the debt. The problem is that these clauses, again, are contracted by the borrowing country, so the country in the global south. There is a risk of increasing costs, so the borrowing is more expensive. You have to pay more interest rates. And maybe it could work if bilateral and multilateral lenders could include them in their loans and their guarantees, their concessional loans and guarantees, but it doesn't work when it's private lending because it's more expensive. And they also rarely trigger because the indicators that they use to make the clause work are very difficult to achieve. It's the same with catastrophe bonds. Catastrophe bonds are a more complex element. A country like the Philippines, for instance, gets a loan or issues a bond that can be, that has to be paid out only in the occasion of a catastrophe not happening. If the catastrophe happens, if there is a hurricane or an earthquake, it can be with different catastrophes, then the bond is not being repaid. The problem is that the parametric criteria that is established for this catastrophe bonds to pay it out does not depend on the impact of these hurricanes, but depends on, for instance, the velocity, the wind speed of a single event in one moment. The Philippines had some of these catastrophe bonds, and maybe Lidy or Mike can tell more about them. And the problem is that even when the Philippines had several hurricanes in a row with very devastating infrastructure, but also human impacts, since none of these events, none of these hurricanes by their own reach the wind speed that was in the contract, then the catastrophe bond didn't trigger. So far, negative experiences. And another false solution is the idea of green bonds. Well, if you want to fight climate change, let's issue bonds, so more borrowing, more debt, including using the proceeds of these bonds to invest in climate mitigation or in climate adaptation. But this also puts the pressure on the global south. It's the global south who is paying for this debt. And finally, there's also this false solution, which is debt for climate swaps. Let's cancel part of the debt of a country, and this country can invest that money into climate mitigation or climate adaptation project. The problem is that the experiences so far haven't been successful at significantly reducing debt burdens. These climate for debt swaps tend to be very complex, lengthy, and have very high transaction costs and are not very cost efficient. There are risks that they do not provide any additionality, so they are financing existing projects already. And some of them can really be conditionality in disguise. So there is a risk for country ownership. And there are experiences of tied aid, so that the donor country, the creditor, uses this debt swap to introduce companies from their own country to invest in the country in the developing south, in the global south. We are at the Eurodad preparing a discussion paper on debt swap. So in around September, we will have also more details about the so-called potentialities, but also the risks of climate for debt swaps. So, and I finish with this: how to deal with these interconnected impacts of the sovereign debt and climate crisis. As Lidy said, we need a systemic change. We need a change that provides just, feminist, and green recovery that actually lays the foundations of solving the debt, but also the climate crisis. And this would start by the recognition and restitution of climate debt. Of course, with a fair, sufficient, non-debt creating climate finance, including finance to address loss and damage. This climate finance could be part of this restitution of climate debt. we have been proposing for some time now a debt payment suspension and debt cancellation in the aftermath of a climate disaster, of a climate extreme event. But definitely this would be only a temporary measure, and what we would like to see in place is, as Lidy was mentioning, a timely and sufficient debt cancellation for all countries in need that can lay the foundations for this systemic change than we need. A couple of more things would be the review of the debt sustainability analysis and the debt sustainability concept. You cannot consider debt sustainable if paying this debt is not allowing a country to invest in climate resilience. And of course, advancing towards a debt workout mechanism, as we mentioned a couple of sessions ago, and then provide emergency and development support in this moment of economic, health, and social crisis. I'll leave it there, and maybe we can take some questions and make the debate more on what should be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iolanda and Lidy. Really informative presentations that I think really help everybody get a sense of this landscape and what are the different bits and pieces to think about. So now we have quite a bit of time for questions and discussion. So please, everybody, add your questions to the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen. You can ask, I think, in any language, and it will get translated one way or another. And maybe to start us off with, we got a really, I think, challenging, nice question from Ouattara Diakalia from Cote d'Ivoire for Lidy. And I'll translate, so it won't be verbatim. But Ouattara is pointing out that there might be some, even though there are these similarities between the debt and climate crisis, there may be also very important differences. She says, I think that the debt crisis is not only pernicious, but also more ancient and more devastating because it is similar to the slavery of modern times, which transcends time. Doesn't the debt crisis engender all the other crises? Civilizational, systemic, economic, political, social, and environmental. So is debt crisis really the crisis of all crises? So Lidy, I think that's a great one for you to start off with. Thanks. And please keep your questions coming.
Yeah, thanks for the really good question there. I believe he or she also had an earlier question that I used Google Translate to understand about whether it's a good solution to borrow or justification to borrow massively in order to address needs of economies in the South. I think, first of all, we need to address that question. Borrowing massively is, yes, something seen as solutions by our governments in order to get resources needed for the country. But this kind of solution is only going to, and it has been proven in the so many decades of dealing with the debt problem, it has been proven to have actually resulted in even worse situation for our economies. So it's neither a solution, and in fact, it's going to be even a bigger problem if that is the solution that governments are chasing, and that is what they are doing. And so it's going to create even bigger problems, which your second suggestion points to, or second question points to. So yes, we are rejecting this massive borrowing in order to meet fiscal needs of countries or in order to meet economic needs of countries. It has not, in any case that I know, in any country that I know, it has not actually helped. For the second question, it's very difficult to compare which is a bigger problem, the debt or climate. It's true, the debt crisis, the debt problem has existed far longer. But it's also true that moving forward, the climate crisis is actually an existential problem. It's not just going to affect our economies and lives, it's going to profoundly change life on Earth as we know it. So I would rather not compare which is more important, which is more pernicious. I believe both problems are actually threatening the very existence of many people and communities in the South. And the important similarity that I wanted to emphasize is that they are all rooted in the same system, and that we need a change of this system in order to address both the debt and the climate crisis. We cannot have only temporary solutions that are not enduring, that are not just, that are not lasting. We cannot avoid or evade the question of system change for both problems. And it's not, I think we're not saying they're the same, but because they're rooted in the same system, we need to approach the solutions in a broader way than what we have been trying to emphasize in the last years. No? So yes, debt cancellation, but we need to address the broader structures that drive this constant borrowing, or that's driving the actually what is also very real, the constant peddling of loans, no, by creditors that use the justification that because our countries are impoverished, we need always this repeated capital infusion. But this kind of capital infusion is going to be a constant need unless we transform the structures that have created poverty and that have impoverished our economies. We are not going to finish this problem if the solution only stops at debt cancellation. If you cancel debts and you change nothing else, it's going to just repeat itself, because countries will pretty soon find themselves even more deeply indebted than in the past, which is what has happened in the last 3 decades that I have witnessed, because we've had major debt relief measures that have been implemented, but we still have the same problem, and it gets worse every time there is a global debt crisis. Climate change, if we do not address it, all other problems on Earth is going to be moot, because we are going to lose hundreds and millions of lives. Livelihoods will be wiped out. The state of our environment will not be able to support the provisioning of life on Earth. So that is also something that we need to be forewarned. The other thing about the debt crisis is that, the climate crisis is that we cannot wait for the worst to happen to understand the urgency of it, because the impacts are irreversible. The changes are not, we cannot go back to a moment in time when the Earth's temperature was 1.5 degrees lower, because that is irreversible. That is why there is a need for adaptation, because we need to adjust our ways of lives, of food production, of many other aspects of living, because these changes are irreversible.
Thank you so much, Lidy. That was really, really clear. So I'm going to ask Iolanda now a technical question that came up. I know I saw you were typing it, but I think it might be useful for everyone to hear again. So that question from Hannah with Oxfam Ibis is if you can repeat the definition of loss and damage and maybe expand a bit on the concept for those less familiar with the climate debates. And I also have my own more sort of technical side question that I would be really grateful if you could expand a bit on. I don't know if you know the answer, but I think in the last slide where you shared some of the potential solutions or at least components that are part of the solution, you discussed, you mentioned debt sustainability assessments. And I was wondering if you could share a bit about how they're done right now and what that might look like, you know, in a bit more detail from if a climate perspective is really integrated in that. Thanks so much. And please keep your questions coming, everyone. We have some time.
Thank you. Thanks, Emma. Before going into those questions, just one comment on what Lidy was saying, which is I absolutely agree. We need a system change. We need to change the way we produce, the way we consume, the way we distribute goods and services. We need to change the way international relations are shaped in order to tackle both crises, the debt and the climate crisis. But I think there's also something that we've been trying to put on the table when talking about debt and climate together, which is if you don't solve the climate crisis, countries will keep going into debt because they need to face the impact. So they will keep borrowing and worsening their debt situation. And if we don't solve the debt crisis, that will have an impact on climate. So countries won't be able to face the climate mitigation and adaptation investments that they need. They won't be able to face the recovery and the reconstruction after a climate extreme event. So it's not one or the other, because one without the other, it's not a solution. We need to tackle both crises to get to a better place. And this links with the issue of loss and damage. So loss and damage refers to the costs, to the loss, to the harms associated with climate change impacts, with climate extreme events, and slow onset events as well. So those events that are not dramatic in the sense of being in one moment, like a hurricane, but for instance, drought that are set up in a longer period. And the UNFCCC set up this the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, which is an instrument to process and deal with providing finance for countries in the global south to be able to face these losses and these damages produced by climate extreme events. So to fund the recovery and the reconstruction after a hurricane, after a drought, after a flood. The issue of loss and damage has been in the agenda for CSOs and for countries in the global south for a long time. Countries in the global north have been blocking the discussions on this for a long time. The last G7 summit ended with a declaration saying we are going to look into it. However, solutions coming from the G7 are never as good as they should be. But it seems this is going to be in the agenda of the COP26. So it's an important issue. And linked with that, some organizations, well, a good number of organizations, like 200 organizations, set up a campaign in 2019, so 2 years ago, to include debt cancellation as a possibility for loss and damage. So when an extreme event happens, the debt from the affected country can be first stopped, and then once the impacts and the damages of that event are evaluated, cancelled to the amount that is needed to cover those the recovery and the reconstruction. On debt sustainability, until now, and I'm going to try to put it very simple and not very technically, Emma. Debt sustainability is what the IMF and the World Bank assess when looking into a country, and they basically look at the capacity of payment. They look if a country has in their fiscal situation capacity to repay the debts, or if they need a debt restructuring, what is called a reprofiling, so changing of the conditions to repay the debt, making an extension of the period for payments, for amortization, or lowering the interest rates, or even canceling part of the debt. What we've been saying for a long time, and I quote Lidy, who's here on this, is that the debt crisis is not when a country cannot pay. A debt crisis comes earlier when a country puts debt payments before human rights, before gender equality, and before climate investment and fighting the climate crisis. So we've been saying these issues should be taken into account when looking at the debt sustainability. There was a motto, I don't know if Lidy, you would remember, many years ago, which said debt sustainability as if people matter. So if you put people in the center of the idea of debt sustainability, a debt would be only sustainable when people's needs and people's rights are covered. It seems the IMF and the World Bank are willing to include climate risks into debt sustainability, but climate risks is not the same as climate needs. Climate risks mean how climate is going to affect the capacity of payment. And we're saying, no, we need to take into account the needs of the country to invest in climate, the needs of the country to invest in human rights, the needs of the country to invest in gender equality. But I don't know, we're a long way from that, but we'll keep pushing for at least a change. I don't know if in the methodology of the IMF, but at least on the concept of climate, of debt sustainability. I hope I made it clearer. I don't know if Lidy wants to comment on that.
Lidy, do you want to add on loss and damage, or the second answer as well? And I have a small comment to make, and then I think we have some more questions.
Yeah, so actually loss and damage is a more recent terminology than adaptation. It came up when everyone realized that there are unavoidable losses and damages, no matter how much you adapt. Right? So the notion of adaptation does not actually cover all that we suffer as impacts of the climate crisis. So groups and countries have begun to talk about loss and damage that is quite related but distinct from the need for adaptation and building resilience. So just that important notion that there is loss and damage that will be unavoidable no matter how much adaptation and building resilience that you will do. And I just want to emphasize that there is a big fight going on about addressing loss and damage, because in the Paris Agreement, the US inserted in the decision text, not in the main agreement, but in the decision text, the colatilia that there should be no discussion of liability and compensation for loss and damage. So that the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage are actually not about mobilizing finance. It's about all these market mechanisms like insurance systems that Iolanda mentioned in her presentation. We are still fighting a big fight so that developed country governments or the global north will actually acknowledge that there is a need for climate finance delivery also for loss and damage. So that's a big fight. And just on this second question, I can only agree with what Iolanda has already said. There are many important reasons why both crises are interlinked, and the most important being that we need to address the same system that has created this crisis. And we cannot just simply talk about short-term solutions, because we will end up just going back to the same dealing with the distress from debt and, not being able to stop the escalation of the climate emergency.
Thank you so much, Lidy. And just to add on that sustainability question, it's true what Iolanda said, that the IMF is slightly opening up to the idea of maybe thinking about climate a little bit, of some components of it in its work and in its debt sustainability work. But just to make that clear for everybody, in case it wasn't, that as of today, the global institution tasked with maintaining, global economic stability is not in any way systematically considering climate risks, let alone needs, financing needs in its debt sustainability work. So any of what you might read about, where a country is at in terms of its debt levels or its debt sustainability doesn't even take any of these things into account, right? So that's an enormous gap that we're facing at the moment as well. Just to point out that there are a few folks sharing some resources on the chat. So thank you for those. And we'll make sure, I think as well, to share those with all the participants after the webinar. We've got a question from Megan Carmody. I think Yolanda's, or no, actually either of you. The question is, will there be a coordinated effort across the DADs in the lead up to COP26 this year, campaigning for these types of solutions? So, Yolanda or Lidy?
About the efforts around the COP, and I think there's also a question about expectations and hopes, no? First of all, after participating in more than a dozen COPs, in more than how many years now, 14, 15 years, we know that we cannot pin our hopes on the international negotiations. So that we need to pursue solutions to the climate crisis, not just in the negotiations, but beyond the negotiations. We have learned that unless you make a big push and compel governments to respond, much like the debt crisis as well, then they're not going to come up with the solutions that are enough, fast enough, and big enough, ambitious enough in order to solve the problems. So what do we expect? There's very specific agendas that are considered in the COP26. One of the very important part of this agenda is a discussion and negotiations around Article 6, which refers to market mechanisms. We know that developing country governments are also wanting to push climate finance back as a top of the agenda of COP26, because there's a move from developed country governments from the north to remove it from the agenda, because for all intents and purposes, according to them, it's no longer an immediate agenda. So there is that going to be a major push on climate finance. And of course, there's a continuing agenda for pushing for higher and bigger ambition for mitigation efforts. Do we hope that these will all be resolved satisfactorily? No, we don't expect it. I think beyond hope, we should make sure that this COP, two things. This COP, one, results in some improvements in some of the policies, because I guess that's the most that we can hope for, but we need to move in other arenas beyond COP in order to push more from governments. And on the other hand, we also need to prevent some of the worst policies that are bound to be passed unless we intervene. And that includes, for instance, policies on the market mechanisms and the attitude towards what we call false solutions, the carbon capture and other geoengineering solutions. And then finally, we also want to raise the issue of this concept of net zero, because net zero brings with it this concept of geoengineering and other false solutions so that they can continue some level of use of fossil fuel energy and of greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the things that we would like to bring up at the COP.
And Yolanda?
Yeah, on the first part of the question, which is the coordinated effort across the DADs. There's always coordinated effort across the DADs. We keep a stable and frequent coordination, and yeah, and we're discussing if we're going to do something particularly on debt and climate in terms of campaigning, but still too early to say what, because we haven't discuss it yet. But yeah, stay tuned, because there's probably going to be things coming on to engage, not only in COP26, but also, I mean, before COP26, we have the World Bank and IMF annual meetings, we have UNCTAD 15, we have the UN General Assembly, and those are all spaces to raise the need for debt cancellation, because the debt service suspension initiative or the common framework are not the debt cancellation that the countries in the global south need. So we will keep pushing for that and link it with the climate emergency for sure.
Thank you both. So we're coming towards, we're approaching the end of the first session. So I want to just give space for now to one more question that I think will be really nice to end this first session on. And then I want to take another one into the second session, because I have a feeling the speakers on the second slot will definitely want to speak to this. So for now, there was a follow-up question from Megan, asking if the speakers can make explicit what system they are actually referring to that needs to change. Because we hear a lot, right, that we hear this slogan, right, system change, not climate change, but she doesn't often hear really explicit criticisms of what system we're actually talking about. And so I'm going to ask both of you if you can be as specific as possible, not just what the system is, but what does it actually look like in practice? What are the types of policies that are part of this system, and how do we recognize it as regular people living our lives? How do we see that express itself? And then I'm going to take Iona's question into the second round, because I think it's a wonderful question that will be great to take after we've had the second presentations. And also I see a hand from Daniela, so we'll take that as well in the second half. So maybe Lidy, do you want to start off on the systems question?
Well, I thought I tried in my first two slides to describe how that system works and what has happened. Well, we only know that there is one dominant global economic system, and that is capitalism. And that is exactly what we have described. In capitalism, the main logic is profit accumulation, profit generation and accumulation. In capitalism, there is concentration of wealth on a few. There is no equitable redistribution of the benefits of the system. There is excessive extraction of natural resources, because there's always a constant pursuit of profit at the expense of people and the environment. There's overproduction, because it's not about meeting people's needs, but it's about producing goods and services that can be bought and profits to be made. So there's also a lot of false consciousness about what do we actually need, no? So there's many things that I said describing this system. Actually, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change actually acknowledges this in part, no? Because they have acknowledged that the climate crisis began with industrialization. And they refer to this process as having started in the 1800s. They also acknowledge that many countries, there is differentiated responsibility and differentiated benefits from this process of industrialization. In fact, the distinction between countries are based on the length of time of your industrialization and the amount of wealth that you accumulated during that industrialization. So there is an acknowledgement that those who bear the greatest responsibilities are the rich and industrialized nations, based also on the length of time they have industrialized. And what industrialization process started in the 1800s and continues to this day, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has also acknowledged through empirical evidence that the greatest and quickest increase of greenhouse gas emissions took place in the period of neoliberal globalization, when there is unfettered markets and unfettered economies where capital can move around freely and generate profit. So there is that partial acknowledgement, but of course they don't name it as capitalism. They call it industrialization. But I just also say that another type of economy that pursues profit and uses fossil fuels in a great extent, will also result in the climate crisis. So when we talk about alternative economies, we have to address this logic. So that requires system change. If you change that logic, it's no longer going to be capitalism.
Yeah, when I started studying economics, they taught me that the economic science was a science of managing resources to cover needs, people's needs. And I think a system change would be to go back to that definition. So to have an economic system that puts in the center the needs of the present and future generations, not just of the people living today, for everyone in the globe, in the planet, which means that instead of profit, you should pursue the satisfaction of those needs, and putting life at the center of any economic activity. So considering if the financial markets are actually providing any added value in terms of covering everyone's needs. And if not, we need to change that. And I think this works very well when it comes to rethinking production, which is what Lidy mentioned about industrialization, but also consumption, distribution, and how all this is decided. And so how we build a system that puts food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, but also any other kind of economic sovereignty at the center, so people can actually decide how we want to produce, what we want to consume to cover everyone's needs, which means democratization of the economic system as well. I had an economic teacher who used to say the alternative to capitalism won't come in a package with a lace. It's a process, and we need to keep deconstructing the present system to keep constructing this kind of social economy. And there are many examples that how this is being done in locally. So we just have to follow those who are doing it.
Thank you very much, Iolanda. That's a nice way to end on a hopeful note. To bring that back down, Miriam van der Stichelen made a comment on the chat pointing out that the financial sector is pushing very much in the G20 meetings, the upcoming G20 meetings, to have private climate finance as a solution and prevent debt cancellation. And, so just adding to this conversation about what the system is we're trying to change, one specific offspring of the neoliberal globalization is specifically financialization, the process by which the private financial sector has taken over a much larger role in the global economy, in individual economies, and has a much larger influence over society in general than it did before, right? And that is the sort of thing that often goes under the radar. Is not necessarily recognized that easily, but it's very much part of this where the power has gone, right, in terms of economic decision making and finding solutions to these problems. So I'll just add that one in. So now we're going to take a quick break just to keep all of your attention. So we're going to come back here at 4:15. So that's, I think, a like 9-minute break for everybody. We'll start promptly so that we'll make sure to have enough time for the second set of speakers. So thanks everybody, just stay logged in and we'll start again in a few minutes. All right, welcome back everybody. I'll give you 5 seconds to get your coffee, get back in your seat. We're starting the second half of today's webinar. So for the second half, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the human rights side of this conversation and the side of gender justice as well. And so we're going to start off again with 2 presentations, and then we should have plenty of time for the Q&A and discussion. So our first speaker, we are very lucky to have with us Juana Sotomayor. She's a human rights officer within the mandate of the UN's independent expert on foreign debt and human rights. Juana will be, just like Lidy, sharing the broader picture with us on the relationship between debt and human rights. And then after that, we have Emilia Reyes, who is the program director of gender policies and budgets for equality and sustainable development at Equidad de Genero in Mexico. And she will dig a little deeper, I think, on the women's rights side in particular. So without further ado, Juana, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Hello, everyone.
Thank you, Emma.
Is it working? Great.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much first to all the organizations behind this excellent initiative of the Dead Wednesdays. I am going to be speaking on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner, specifically on the mandate on foreign debt. So I am speaking on an official capacity, which means that there are some thoughts I would like to make that I won't be able to make this afternoon. I also want to start by saying, and perhaps the next slide should be, let me see what is happening. Okay. I would like to start with saying that there are no human rights without financial resources, without resources. And this is the central link between debt and human rights. I think all of us here know that all human rights require financial resources. This is true for civil and political rights, for example, for courts, for police, for security services. These require funding, of course, and it is also true for economic, social, and cultural rights, but not exclusively. We often say that for health systems, for housing, for social protection, we need funding, but the reality is that all human rights require funding, and when a specific government, a specific state, has to choose between debt servicing or infrastructure, for example, in the COVID era, hospitals, vaccines, or paying the salary of doctors and nurses, that choice is a human rights choice as well, and a tension, a very permanent tension. The second point I want to put on the table is the fact that all human rights are indivisible and interdependent, and I am sure everybody has heard this a lot. But the reality is that we cannot exercise, for instance, our right to education without also having a guarantee on other rights like freedom of expression freedom of association, or labor rights for teachers, for example. So the rights are always interconnected. It's very difficult to separate one from the other. And to make a link between this presentation and the previous one, I want to add to the excellent slide that Iolanda shared with us, that indeed we have right now a vicious circle of climate crisis, debt crisis, but also inequalities. Socioeconomic inequalities, inequalities between, within and among countries. Just to mention a figure, in the last couple of days, the UN Secretary General pointed out that there was a 5 trillion surge in wealth of the world richest in the past year, while at the same time, 120 million people were added to the statistics on extreme poverty. So inequalities have been exacerbated by the pandemic, but we were already in a crisis mode before the pandemic. This is important for us from the human rights community, from the human rights perspective, and it links to 2 key principles that I will like to speak to today. The first one is what we call the maximum of available resources. Essentially, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which was written in the 60s and is now almost 55 years old, already identified that in order to ensure the protection of these rights, states had to take steps within their own budgets, but also through international assistance and cooperation. So there was an international element to it, to the maximum of its available resources to achieve the full realization of the rights in the covenant. And this is important to understand, because when we're talking about debt and human rights, we're really talking about the use of available resources, the combination of available resources, national and international, for the provision of rights. The second principle that is critical for any discussion on human rights is the principle of non-discrimination, which is, interestingly, it's drafted in the same way in both covenants, the Economic and Social Rights Covenant and the Civil and Political Rights Covenant. And essentially, it says that nobody should be discriminated for any reason. There should be no distinction between any individual, any person, from any source or any status, any reason for discrimination. These 2 principles have served the Committee on Economic and Social Rights to often and consistently remind and provide guidance to different states about the need to ensure that the resources are used to realize human rights, but also to prioritize those groups that are more disadvantaged and more vulnerable to discrimination. So whenever a state, a country has to decide what to do with its limited resources, it should prioritize the most vulnerable. I think it is very important to keep in mind that this prioritization might not be easy at times, but human rights come first. Most countries in the world have ratified several international human rights instruments, one of which is the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, but there are others. And this means that they have obligations to make use of their resources with a priority for people over debt. And I have just outlined here some of the guidance that came out from the committee in relation to austerity measures, which are often conditionalities of loan agreements, and are often linked also to structural adjustment policies, because the committee has clearly mentioned that states have the responsibility, both borrower and lending states have the responsibility to ensure that whatever those conditionalities are, they are not going to violate economic, social, and cultural rights, and are not going to become an unjustifiable retrogressive measure. And there are some criteria, they are outlined in this slide, but I want to reassure or underline the fact that for the committee, consistently, whenever it's reviewing specific countries or whenever it's making broad statements about debt, austerity, and the respect of this covenant, the committee is always reminding states, lenders and borrowers, that any debt conditionality should not lead to retrogression. Another committee that has also put out important guidance in relation to debt and to the use of resources is the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And it is important to remember that the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most widely ratified convention in the UN system, with essentially all countries by one having ratified it. The committee in charge of this convention a few years ago, in 2016, prepared a general comment or an authoritative explanation on public budgeting for the realization of children's rights. And this general comment has very specific references to the need to ensure sustainable debt management, not to put in danger children's rights or to impact negatively the protection, guarantee, respect of children's rights due to debt conditionalities, for example. And it also refers to the need for child rights impact assessments. We often talk about human rights impact assessments of fiscal policies and debt in general. I think this guidance is important, but I now want to refer also to some of the work that has been done by the mandate of the independent expert on foreign debt and human rights. This mandate has a longer title. This is a summary. The current independent expert is Ms. Yufen Lee. She will be ending her term at the end of July, but in the year, more or less year that she has been working as independent expert, she has put out some very important reports precisely for the discussion between debt, human rights, and the COVID-19 pandemic, including a report, her first thematic report to the General Assembly last year, in which she called for debt and emergency response, debt relief, debt cancellation, and better, faster, more sustainable responses to the debt crisis. Currently, within the mandate, we are working on her next report, which will be on the international debt architecture reform and human rights. These reports should be available at around the end of August, early September, and several of the organizations that are actually part of the series of webinars have contributed greatly to the preparation of this report. In the mandate, in the case of the previous independent experts, I just want to mention a few examples of other things that have been done, which explicitly link human rights, international instruments, and debt issues. One of them is the report by the former independent expert Juan Pablo Bogoslavsky on the guiding principles on human rights impact assessment of economic reforms. This was prepared in 2019 after 2 years' work in which there was focus on several issues, including labor rights and women human rights. And I think it is a very timely report, because if it had been taken on board more consistently, several of the situations in which we find countries now in relation to COVID could have been potentially prevented or better handled. This report is, of course, available. These guiding principles are available. Another very important document that was prepared by the previous independent expert, Cephas Lumina, is actually guiding principles on foreign debt and human rights. This was prepared in 2011 and endorsed by the Human Rights Council in 2012. And these guiding principles are really a key document to understand how to use the international human rights standards that we have and apply them to specific challenges and realities of debt management, debt restructuring, and sustainability. I have just highlighted here a couple of things. There are 86 principles. Some are foundational principles in section 2. I don't know if you see my cursor, and another part are operational principles. Within the foundational principles, some of the points I already mentioned, such as primacy of human rights, equality and non-discrimination, progressive realization and not retrogression, are part of these guiding principles. There are two other documents I wish to flag before my time is up. One is a previous report by Juan Pablo Bohoslavsky, the independent expert, on the impact of economic reforms and austerity measures on women's human rights, which will connect with the next, with my co-panelist, Emilia. And it is also very relevant because it's one of the few times that you will see a UN document from a special rapporteur discussing unpaid care work, and it's quite relevant. And another report, which is not linked to sovereign debt or default or the macroeconomics that we have been discussing, is Juan Pablo's report on private debt, which is very timely and also very relevant for the situation in which a lot of households and individuals find themselves due to the COVID pandemic. The weight of private debt, which can lead to very serious human rights issues as well, is addressed in this report. Finally, just a word of goodbye. I will be taking questions, of course, but just to flag that all these reports are available, some of them in user-friendly formats, in different languages, and also that the mandate has a Twitter account if you wish to follow us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juana. That was really comprehensive and really great to give people an overview for those that aren't so much in the details of what human rights actually means. So next we're gonna go to Emilia. You have the floor.
Thank you so much for this. It's for me a great pleasure. It's really an honor to be here. I was thinking since the moment I was invited that I didn't know why I was here. Actually, the organizers could better address these issues than me. And all of the people in the panel and many people in the audience are actually my mentors, my teachers, the colleagues from which I have learned so much. I have so much respect, and we are fighting in this together. So I feel really very honored in being in this session, that I think it's more of an exchange of our restlessness and trying to find ways in which we can deal with these jointly. but really, for me, I just cannot explain how relevance is for me in being in this webinar series. And after all I've learned from all of the dads and all of the work of the amazing people working on the ground in the movement on death justice. So I just wanted to start by acting as a weather girl, showing you why the agenda of unpaid domestic and care work is so important to address. In reality, all of the issues of macroeconomy and macro challenges from the point of view of gender. This is not an issue about women and men. This is really about economic activity and production. So if you can see my diagram here, you know, this is a diagram of all monetized and non-monetized value. So the big picture here is that 2/3 of this circle is the value of here is generated by unpaid domestic and care work, which is mostly done by women. So this is all of the non-monetized value generated in the world. And that, of course, is sustaining life, sustaining the planet, as Lidy and Iolanda already mentioned about all of the ways in which we interrelate with our planet. And so this is the part that women are doing. This small section here is voluntary work, in which here we can see some men doing community work, etc. But mostly this is the part, this is also unpaid. But this is the part that mostly is done by women. And then we have here the section of monetized work, this monetized value. This is actually what the orthodox economy accounts for: economic processes and exchanges. And when we are told about figures in amount of million, billions, whatever, it is all in this quarter here. This is paid domestic work. This is the work that is done by externalizing the work, care of domestic work internally in our houses. By sometimes what we say is that we are externalizing the work to other women, like indigenous women, migrant women, etc., women of poor resources and lack of access to many rights like education, etc. And so they mostly are also engaged in this segment of the activity. And this is everything else. This is private, this is public, this is employment, this is informal work, etc. So in this, as you see, I'm trying to make first a picture of what is monetized and non-monetized, but second also that women are here, but also women are working on the unpaid section, but of course women are also in the paid section where there is money. But here we also make a distinction on paid and informal and formal, because of course women are here receiving 10% of the money that circulates in the world. Really, women are owners of the 10% of the money that circulates in the world. 10% of this is in the hands of women. Why? Because also when we go to paid work, there is another element that we need to see, which is formal and informal. So women are mostly on the informal segments of paid work, but also when they are in formal work, they are also at the lower strata in the precarious work, outsourced, with the gender wage gaps, with the glass ceilings, etc., facing violence in the workplace, etc. So this picture, I think it's the most important one, because this didn't come out of nothing. This refers to the sexual division of labor, in which men are assigned to do productively some things and women have been assigned to do productively other things. And I don't have the time, but let me tell you, if you think about a myth, right? Like Freud's a myth of totem and taboo, like a myth, how did the state was born? Well, in this sexual division of labor, then men were assigned to security, decision-making, providing, and they developed these into a very sophisticated way, and that became the state. Like, you know, the main functions of the states are those, and also the tasks of women were left for the domestic segment. And it may seem like very simplistic, it may is, but precisely it has to do with everything that we're talking about in this webinar, because the state actually started to grow. And this is where I'm also saying that it's not about a war between men and women, because the state started to become a third actor that had nothing to do with individuals and with institutions. Well, they surpass even generations, and they can last. And of course, they can have revenue, they can plan, they can foresee to the longer view, etc. So this has been very important, because as the state grew stronger, it started to take on some elements that were assigned for women, like education. Firstly, that was the first element that undertook under its wing, and then later on, health. So the modern states, very late in the 20th century, some even before, started to take health under their wing. And you know, in Qatar, the first public clinic started in 1975. You know, it is the notion that the state does not need to take care of this. This is secondary task. And we see that because precisely when there is a debt crisis, and then we have adjustments, measures or counter-cyclical measures and recommendations from the IFIs and stuff, that you need to cut down expenses, so that you need to pay and refix your finance internally. So you cut on where? Social spending. And what is that social spending? Those elements that are connected to the sexual division of labor assigned to women. So they cut on health, they cut on education, on the provision of services for the population. And what happens is that women are already doing this, and let us say the reduction of the state in taking care of this just happens to, it just happens that all of those tasks go back to the tasks of women. So this is why we say that women are shock absorbers, that because on climate change, whatever happens with the depletion of the biodiversity, with an undermining of the natural elements, etc., it is women who now will have to take a bigger burden in acquiring water or food, or etc. So women are not only absorbing the debt crisis, they are absorbing the economic crisis, the environmental crisis, etc. Women are, as actually economists expect for women to be the shock absorbers, and the IFIs and stuff, they all rely, because all of these tasks, education, health, etc., they need to be done anyway. So, but they know that they're externalizing those into women back to the domestic space. So this is for me the most important element to emphasize, because austerity measures, as Juana was already mentioning, the report on 2018 on the impacts of austerity and debt on women's human rights is precisely stating how austerity measures and the debt crisis is impacting women more, precisely because of the relation it has with unpaid domestic and care work. And of course, we can go into analyzing in a sectorial manner how precisely also because the sexual division of labor, when the responses are coming, they come to industrialized sectors that are also more male, with an occupancy of male, like infrastructure, like agriculture, but in large crops, like transportation, communication, energy, etc. So it's the same with a just transition for people and the planet. When you think about climate change and where is the finance going to be allocated, if you don't add the gender perspective, then again, all of the solutions for climate change are going to go for men, which, by the way, were in those sectors responsible for promoting the gas emissions, and women have been on the receiving end on the negative impacts. And again, in this new transition, they will not receive the proper funding or capacity building or access to technology, etc. So I know I extended myself too long on this, but this is really key, because the IFIs, for instance, and all of the solutions, we've seen that in COVID, everybody went back home. We've seen how there is a cut on access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. We've seen an increase on violence against women. Actually, this has to do also with an intersectional approach, because you will go deeper into those women who are on groups of population who are facing multidimensional discrimination. Then of course their burden increases, and the lack of access to human rights is also adding an extra layer because of that in a very sophisticated web. So what we've seen is that when you only look at the notion of economy and recovery solutions, and you're only seeing this, again, you're only repairing this net in which the women are also always at the bottom, and not really adding solutions. But not only on emergency elements, this is precisely what we were saying about system change. And we've been monitoring the FFD discussions, the G20, the G7, all of the absurd conversations happening. And when you say you need to take into account gender, they say, oh yes, women's empowerment. No, we don't want women's empowerment. We want the state to take ownership of their role as duty bearers in ensuring women's human rights. And that has all of the implications that Juana already mentioned. But also second, this is also why we are also not only critical of the notion of empowerment, because it's displacing the responsibility on the shoulders of women in this systemic notion, scheme, but also of resilience, because against the notion of resilience is shifting the responsibility to communities rather than the shifting of the system that needs to happen here. And of course, Miriam already mentioned the role of the private sector, and it takes a lot to unpack there on the way they are extracting wealth. Before I finish, just want to give another figure. The richest billionaires on earth last year, they got a profit of an estimation of $10.2 trillion. And the estimation of the value that women generated in unpaid domestic work last year was $10.8 trillion. You follow me? It's also, this is in correlation. This is where the extraction is happening. The exploitation of the concentration of wealth and all of this damage that is done for the people on the planet is also happening in relation to the sexual division of labor and this exploitation. So I'd say this is also, this is why we say that gender is a macro agenda and not a micro, not a mezzo, not to be solved at a national level or a regional level. This has to do with the systemic change that we're aiming at. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emilia. That was incredibly rich and just so helpful in helping us all understand why we're talking about system change, right? And why we're not talking about something superficial. So I'd like to first invite Iolanda again to turn on her camera because now we have our remaining Q&A, and of course we feel free to ask any specific questions about the presentations you just saw, but also this is a chance for us to pull both conversations together, right? The first half on what we heard on climate and talk about what to do with all of this information. I see we have some questions on the chat, but I thought I would take my chair's privilege for 1 minute to just sort of paint also the real urgency of the questions that Juana and Emilia raised in the COVID context. Emilia referred to it a little, but what we saw when the pandemic triggered a global economic crisis is that the global financial response to what was happening has not been anywhere near enough for the global south. The financing made available has just not been anywhere near any estimates of what is actually needed. Most of it has come in the form of loans, not grants, meaning it's just kicking this debt can further down the road, right? And what a lot of people maybe haven't seen so much of is that a lot of the COVID financing that has already gone out the door was made was done as governments made commitments to international finance institutions to the same broken policies that led us all here in the first place and that have undermined our social protection and health and care systems all this time. And they're not strictly, in most cases, these really formal conditions. So people are trying to get away with saying this is not, these are, this isn't conditionality. But make no mistake, almost every single government in the South has made real commitments over this year, over next year, over the next 5 years to apply really drastic austerity measures. And the latest report that was done by Isabel Ortiz and Matthew Cummings on this is projecting that this is going to be affecting 6.6 billion people by next year. So it's incredibly urgent that these broken policy prescriptions are changed right now in this context. And we see that as the largest sort of urgent existential threat to human rights and especially women's rights, and will definitely increase their unpaid care burdens in this year and the next few years for sure. So on that note, we have two questions I think to start off with. One, and I'll take them both because they're both from Iona. So the first is for Juana. Can you share any examples, if any, of human rights litigation related to debt and any use by states or organizations of the guiding principles on economic reforms? That would be really great. And then I'm going to give this one to Emilia because I have a feeling you might want to speak to the second question, which says that we've been talking about the need for systemic solutions that go beyond short-term debt relief measures, addressing root causes, focusing on systemic effects. All this keeps coming up in progressive conversations regarding the global economy. But it seems that we might be missing a common blueprint or roadmap outlining a political program of action straddling various issue areas and that's relevant to both the global North and South. How do we get there? And are we aware of the Progressive International movement? Could that be a potential focal point for various initiatives like this coming together? So that's, I think, a really good question. But I'll start off with Juana.
Thank you, Emma, and many thanks for the very interesting questions and comments also on the chat box. In relation to whether states have been using the guiding principles on economic reform or human rights impact assessment of economic reform policies, what I can say is that as far as I am aware, the government of Argentina has been not necessarily applying all of them, but making use of them to consider some of their current work on debt and debt restructuring and also on economic policies. But I don't have a very specific reference to how far they have gone in applying the entire guiding principles. And you know, the guiding principles cover quite a bit of issues. And in some cases, it seems that some governments will choose a piecemeal fashion to take some on board, but not necessarily the full spectrum of these guiding principles. In relation to litigation, I don't want to refer to something that I might need to take back later. But what I can promise is that I will send you a more specific response with some examples of relevant human rights litigation that has used debt as the main issue. I do know that there has been litigation in relation to specific austerity measures, for example, in relation to labor rights in different places. I also know that part of the human rights elements to challenge debt have been used for issues related, for example, to regressive taxation, instead of actually finding more progressive solutions in terms of tax and revenues at the domestic level to cope with the need for liquidity and financing. And Emma, since I have the floor, I also want to address a point that is in the chat box. I believe it's Watara, in relation to whether international human rights law talks about debt as a violation of human rights. I want to say that, and this is actually the current independent expert has also said it in her report, debt per se is not necessarily bad. Several governments need debt, some level of debt that can be positive for development. It can be positive for poverty reduction, and it has been used positively for a number of years for these objectives. However, what is very tricky and what needs to be strictly justified in human rights terms, and I repeat, it has to be strictly justified, is domestic measures that will lead to retrogressive policies. So the debt per se might not be as problematic as the conditionalities that come with that debt, and mean, for example, increasing taxes, reducing jobs, closing certain social services, changing the retirement age, all these sort of policies that we have seen, and Emma already mentioned the excellent paper by Isabel Ortiz and Matthew Cummings, which actually summarize a long list of these sort of austerity policies that often come as conditionalities, and those might be very controversial in human rights terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Emilia, for the second question, please.
Yes, thank you. First, I wanted to say what I omitted to say is that right along the sexual division of labor, there is another relevant division of labor, which is the geographic division of labor. And that relates precisely to the exploitation that the global north is doing on the global south. And I think Lidy and Iolanda went very far in explaining precisely this notion of current colonialism that we're seeing. And I want to call it by its name. And this is why I also take the opportunity to stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine, because I think the occupation, the colonial settlers, the occupation and the apartheid that is happening in Palestine is really condensing all of the impacts of colonialism in one single territory. And we can see the inequality of vaccines, in the environmental, the lack of access to rights, etc., and the support of the powerful governments to this impunity, and just because of the extraction of oil, and to have an empire there to keep on deciding on the biggest issues for the world. So I just wanted to really emphasize that the global division of labor is something that really needs to be at the core of our language, that we need to be decolonial. And I'm saying that it is very important that in all of our proposals, they're not abstracts. We have to be decolonial, we have to be feminist, we have to be in support of the human rights agenda, and there is no middle ground for this. So going back to the question, I just pasted in the chat. We have an initiative on the FFD groups, and stay tuned, because we have now Twitter and Instagram, and we're going to very fun dances and stuff, because we are packaging like a thread of macro demands that are tying everything together from a feminist and the colonial point of view. Our demands on debt, tax, trade, on PPPs, on technology, etc. And all of these elements you can go and see in the website are bringing us really a comprehensive view of all of the elements, how they're intertwined, but also how without any of these components, we cannot really address all of the problems that are happening and that are impacting even worse people at the global level. So this is something that we want to emphasize, and the campaign of campaigns has to purposes. The first one is really to support and enhance the advocates who are doing this global work, but and really to make visible the relevance of global activism, because without that, then the limits really of what we can achieve at the local and national level is very limited. And the other is really to expand and try to rally and bring support from, let us say, regular people who are living their lives but are really impacted, on how we can translate these messages and these agendas into people, into different groups, and also engage with different dialogues, cross dialogues within movements, within regions, etc. Because we have a lot of learning to do, and we are at this point in the political stage of the Campaign of Campaigns, reaching out to other movements and other projects, like we are planning on Progressive International, but other different movements that are working more locally, or also those who are only working on specific sector or issues. But we think that this is a time to really garner collective work. So stay tuned for the Campaign of Campaigns. Look out on Facebook. Tomorrow we will have an informal chat with a coffee in hand and trying to talk about what is feminist economic justice, and we will be having different ideas. Thank you for this.
Amazing, Emilia. Well, I think we have run out of questions, but also out of time. So it's perfect, I think, to end on the Campaign of Campaigns, because that also leads very nicely to the next webinar in this series, which, just getting my notes here, which is really about what every one of you can be doing to be part of the debt justice movement, the climate justice movement, the gender justice movement, and help us bring all of that together. So the next webinar is really about activism and advocacy and how to get involved. So I'd really warmly welcome everybody or warmly invite everybody to attend the next webinar as well. And then I think I'm going to close. So I want to thank, first of all the speakers. Very, very much. It's been an absolute pleasure, like big virtual hugs. And I hope we get to see each other soon in person as soon as possible. Then I also would really like to thank the interpreters of today. And I think I have the names, is David, Laia, Claire, Kathy, Elena, and Adria. So thank you very much for the translating of words that are probably not very straightforward and for our fast talking. And thank you all for joining us in this conversation, for your amazing questions and sharing your resources as well. There will be a follow-up where the presentations will be shared and some of the other resources that were mentioned today. And I wish you all a very lovely, lovely rest of your day, morning, afternoon, evening, and until next time. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, Emma, for facilitating wonderfully.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you all. Ciao.